It drives me crazy sometimes when I see all of the online gurus that have made hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars or billions of dollars making statements such as, "You'll never get rich working for someone else." While on the surface that seems true, I've got some very good anecdotal evidence that it is, in fact, far from the truth. I'm Greg with Job Tips and Straight Talk, and this is a straight talk message about becoming wealthy while being just a regular Joe employee working for someone else. How can that possibly be, you might say? Now, I will tell you that the advice I'm going to give you is not something that I have always followed myself. I have not been a good student of some of this, but I know a number of people who have been more disciplined over the years of their lives than I was 20, 30 years ago, and who today are multi-millionaires in today's dollars, and they never worked for themselves. They always worked for someone else. One example I'm going to give you actually did work for himself, but it was a very small little masonry business that was just him. And he had a helper from time to time, but he never made a lot of money. He lives in Southern California. In fact, I'll just share with you his story now. Today, he's in his mid 70s. He drives an everyday car, lives in an everyday old house, wears everyday clothing that you'd think he's owned for 20 years, and okay, his shoes need to be replaced, and the cars he drives are always paid for, but they're beaters. Okay, so this is a bit of an exaggeration, but of some things that you may have heard or seen before, but this is real. This gentleman's name is Ruben. Out of respect to his privacy, I will not give his last name. Um, but he lives well below his means, and that's the key. We tend to have a mindset that, well, I earn good money, and so therefore I deserve to have a bigger house, a nicer car, a boat, a you name it, new clothes all the time, the latest fashion in sunglasses or suits, or you follow my point here. But this gentleman, Ruben, just made everyday money. In fact, I would argue less than average wages in his small, very, very, very super small business, but just didn't spend it. I heard an adage years and years ago that it's not so much how much you earn as it is how much you don't spend, which will be more the determining factor in in terms of, will you become wealthy one day? Will you become independently wealthy enough to where you don't worry about a thing financially? You still live well within your net worth, and life is good. So, again, this gentleman, you'd be shocked to meet him in a store or something, and you'd never think that he was extremely wealthy. But today, he owns several acres of property in Orange County, California. In fact, downtown, I think the city of Orange in Orange County, California. Office buildings and his property up in the mountains, and you'd be absolutely shocked. But his personal lifestyle is that of a very old, somewhat rickety house, old beat up cars, as I said before, old clothing, doesn't care to impress anyone with the material goods. But he has just been very smart and has sort of determined that I'm not going to have financial stress. I'm going to live well within my means. Okay, so that's example number one. And today, people don't really know how much exactly he's worth. He's very careful, but it would be well into the millions just because of the increasing of values of the real estate portfolio that he has. Another example is a gentleman who worked for a company. He's now retired from that company, but same company I worked for many years ago, called International Truck and Engine Corporation, otherwise known as Navistar on the stock exchange. They manufacture heavy truck, so semis and school buses and that kind of thing. Diesel engines. They're a big truck manufacturer. If you think of Kenworth and Peterbilt and Volvo and Mack and et cetera, Freightliner, and then there's International as well. Well, this gentleman worked for International. And when I was interviewing for the job that I eventually got, I was introduced to him, introduced to him, and prior to the introduction, the man who became my boss said privately said, "I'm going to introduce you to our resident millionaire." Now, this was a guy who I knew the pay ranges in the jobs that he had didn't make more than about $80,000 per year as a field sales manager. Had no direct reports, so he didn't have staff. It was just him. He was assigned the various accounts, and it wasn't a sales job where he made really high commissions, and therefore, you can get very wealthy in sales with a certain sort of sales structure in some companies. It was not that. He was simply a representative calling on dealerships and certain fleet accounts, and that was just his job, just a basic job. Even with bonus money, I would say never made more than about $95,000 during his per year during his tenure, and he only retired a few years ago. So we're not talking about making huge money, maybe $90,000, 30 years ago. No, no, no. So let's be realistic. At the recording date of this, today's recording date is in the year 2023, and he retired from that company about 10 years ago. And only so 2013, 2012, he was making around $75,000, $80,000 a year. That's it. But what Frank, his name is Frank, but what Frank did over the years is, again, lived well within his means, made sure that the home he lived in was modest, made sure that the clothing he wore was nice, but was not expensive. And he always put a percentage of his income into real estate holdings. He would save enough money to put a down payment on a small commercial building, a couple small residential buildings over time, properties, more commercial buildings, and just over time, his real estate portfolio grew very, very nicely. And so, he went through some ups and downs when recession hits, and sometimes the tenants in your commercial buildings, they end up bailing on you, so you have some vacancies. He would weather those storms, but he just, used his money smartly, intelligently, made smart, intelligent real estate purchases. And he was, before he even retired from International Truck, he was already a multi-millionaire net worth wise, was very successful. So much so that he even, after a bit of time, was able to purchase a couple nice 40-foot boats after he made his money. But these are people who became wealthy. Now, what's wealthy? That's a relative term. To be worth $2 or $3 million is nothing compared to a billionaire. A billion is 1,000 million, right? So, or maybe it's not wealthy compared to somebody who's worth $300 million. I understand that. So the term wealthy is a relative term compared to what? But to the extent that one is able to have enough financial resources and then live so well within your means that there's no financial stress and will likely not be for the rest of your life, that's pretty wealthy. It's not common, I would say, to look at salaried personnel, people that make modest incomes or a decent living, for those people to end up with millions of dollars in the bank. But in Frank's case and in Ruben's case, again, it wasn't how much they earned, it was how much they didn't spend. Rather, they invested it in vehicle being like real estate, other sorts of investments that would grow in value and increase their net worth. So, and again, I must tell you, I've not been wise in following this advice in my nearly 60 years of living. But I'll tell you what, I do fine. But to know these individuals who did the simple math and said, I'm not going to be the one that needs to have the new house, the expensive car, the nice clothes all the time, the nicest of this and that, because all that costs money. All of that costs money. I'll give you one more example. And this is a gentleman who was married to my wife's cousin. His name was Robert. He never made big money, but you know what? And yet he raised 6 children for, I think, all of their years. They homeschooled the kids. His wife was a stay-at-home mom. He, in fact, was a preacher and an evangelist, and not a high-paid preacher and evangelist either. But he had an eye for value. And so he raised each of his kids with Goodwill clothing, but he knew where the deals were. He knew how to. He knew where the good Goodwills were, one of which is was at least in Atlanta. And in looking at how his kids dressed, how he dressed, how his wife dressed, you would think that they were buying all their clothing from Nordstrom's or Dillard's, or I mean, Dillard's is not necessarily a super high-end department store, but you name it, a really, really super nice store because the clothing was very high quality brand name stuff. But he just never paid retail. He went to Goodwill, found the deals, bought them, and dressed 6 children quite beautifully. It was wonderful, and saved his money, invested, and made a really good chunk of change over the years. Didn't become wealthy by any means, but in looking at how he lived, the kind of house that he would buy would be like a fixer-upper, if you will. He was quite handy. He would go to Lowe's or Home Depot. We always used to say he had a Home Depot moment. He would go to Home Depot, look up the store manager, and ask, what do they have of broken case lots of whatever. For example, shingles, a broken case of 60 pounds of shingles that they can't now sell as a case of shingles. He would negotiate a super cheap price. And the same thing for sinks and lighting and you name it. And so he was able to do some remodels on some properties that he purchased inexpensively. And he did the bulk of the work himself because he knew how, and turned the house into an absolute amazing property. And was then able to sell the properties and make good money. And this is a guy again who, from time to time had a decent paying job, but nothing big, but just invested his money wisely and did extremely well over the years. So, enough said. Remember, it's not how much you earn, it is how much you don't spend. You'll be tempted to buy all the toys, have all the goodies, take all the vacations, do all the things, reward yourself. After all, you've worked hard for it. So spend $5,000 or $10,000 on a Rolex, or buy a Mercedes, or whatever the case may be. Look at your bank account at the end of a certain period of time and see, are you really living in a way that prevents you from being stressed? You'd be surprised when you look at people that are driving the most expensive cars or live in the biggest houses. Don't get too comfortable in the idea that they are wildly successful and life is great and grand for them. Well, they may be making really good money to be able to afford to buy a $1 million house and maybe have a couple of Mercedes or BMW cars in the parking lot, in the driveway rather. But what you don't know is the level of stress that they very well may be under. Now, they may also be quite wealthy and doing just fine, but you don't know that. And I have, over my lifetime, met a lot of people that looked the part. They made the money. They also spent it. And boy, they looked like they had the world by the tail and were financially on top of the world, but they were not. They were stressing like crazy. I'll just share with you one last quick story and I'll let you go. Many, many, many years ago, in a land far, far away, I used to sell tires. I used to be a store manager for Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in California. We had a customer come in who later became friends of mine and the owner of the store. But she came in one day. She needed tires for her Corvette. Now, this was a gal. In fact, she has long since passed away. So I'm not speaking ill of the dead. She was a lovely lady. But, at the time, she had all the fancy big rocks and all the bling bling. She was an advertising executive for a local radio station. And that's how we got to know her, because we advertised on the radio station that she sold advertising for. And she came in one day in a gorgeous Corvette with the very expensive low profile wide tires that Corvettes have. And when we gave her the price of tires for her car, she cried. She couldn't afford it. She had all the rocks on her finger, the watches, the look, all the manicured fingernails and all the fancy stuff. And boy, you would think that she was just rocking, man. But she couldn't even afford tires for her car. Now, again, not speaking ill of her. She's very sweet. She was a very sweet lady. But there's another great example. Someone who made really good money and could have been very, very financially independent at some point in time, but looked like she had it all together and privately stressed like you wouldn't believe financially. So prevent yourself from being in that situation. Live well within your means. It's not how much you make, it's how much you don't spend, and you will do just fine. Well, I'm Greg with Job Tips and Straight Talk. I would appreciate if you would subscribe to the channel. Give me some comments down below what you think about this video and other topics you might want to see me discuss. These are completely unedited, unscripted, completely raw videos. So all the oopsies and things, you'll see in these videos as well on the job tips. On the, see, there's another oopsie, on the Straight Talk videos. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. I hope you have the kind of day that you want to have. Take care.